At 5:47 in the morning, an IRGC gunboat opened fire without warning. No radio communication, no signal, no demand. Just weapons fire on a cargo vessel 15 nautical miles northeast of Oman, a Liberian-flagged ship with a Greek owner and an international crew that had no part in any conflict between any nation. 3 hours later, it happened again. A Panama-flagged container ship called the Euphoria was fired upon 8 nautical miles off the Iranian coast. It changed course and escaped. But a third vessel, the MSC Francesca, was not so fortunate. IRGC naval units forced it into Iranian waters under armed escort. The footage was published. The claim was made. Iran had seized ships. And then the world waited for the American response. Trump said nothing, no strike order, no dramatic announcement, no retaliatory action of any kind. Because here is what Iran just failed to understand about the trap it is sitting in. Every provocative move it makes, every ship it fires on, every threatening statement it broadcasts to the world is not weakening the American position in this crisis. It is strengthening it. And what is coming through the water right now, 3 days away, will make everything that has happened before look like the opening act. Stay with me, because the next 72 hours in the Strait of Hormuz may be the most consequential hours of this entire conflict. And the clock is already running. To understand why Trump is not responding to Iran's provocations and the way Iran needs him to respond, you need to understand what the blockade is already doing to the Iranian regime without a single additional missile being fired. 31 ships turned back by CENTCOM order. 4 Iranian tankers seized, 8 more stopped and forced to reverse course. Iranian oil exports effectively at zero. Revenue losses running at $400 to $500 million per day. Total losses approaching $4 billion and accelerating. Trump wrote on Truth Social in language that did not leave room for diplomatic interpretation. Iran is financially collapsing. They want the Strait of Hormuz opened immediately. Starving for cash. Losing $500 million a day. Military and police complaining they are not getting paid. That last detail is the one that matters most. When a regime cannot pay its own security forces, the architecture of control that keeps it in power begins to develop cracks that no amount of propaganda can paper over. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent provided the timeline that sits beneath all of Iran's calculations right now. In a matter of days, Karg Island storage will be full, and Iran's oil wells will begin shutting down. That sentence, understood fully, reveals why the next 72 hours carry the weight they do. Oil well shutdown is not a reversible policy decision. It is a geological event. When underground pressure is released through forced shutdown under blockade conditions, reservoir damage begins accumulating that can take months to repair in the best case, and in the worst case, permanently reduces production capacity that took decades to build. Every day the blockade holds past the storage threshold, Iran is not just losing current revenue. It is permanently degrading the asset base that would generate future revenue, even after any eventual deal removes the pressure. The blockade is not just destroying Iran's income, it is destroying Iran's capacity to generate income in the future. Iran's foreign minister called the blockade an act of war, but Iran does not have the power to lift it, and the United States is not interested in lifting it. Not yet. Not while time is doing exactly what Washington needs time to do. Now look at what is 3 days away. The USS Jed R. Ford and the USS Abraham Lincoln are already positioned in the CENTCOM area of operations. Between them, they represent the most powerful naval force the United States has deployed to any theater in decades. The USS George H.W. Bush is coming. It is rounding the Cape of Good Hope to avoid the Houthi threat at Bab el-Mandeb. Open-source flight tracking data places it near the coasts of Tanzania and Kenya. In 3 days, it arrives in the Gulf Theater. When it does, something historically rare occurs. 3 full American carrier strike groups will be simultaneously concentrated around a single operational theater. 3 carriers, dozens of Aegis destroyers, submarine coverage below. More than 50,000 U.S. military personnel integrated into a single combat architecture above, across, and beneath the water. The Joint Chiefs have established a blockade framework for Hormuz that extends from Oman's southern coast to the Iran-Pakistan border. It is not simply maritime interdiction. It is a fully integrated missile defense architecture covering every threat axis simultaneously. And the buildup does not stop at the waterline. More than 150 fighter jets are being deployed to the region. F-22 Raptors, F-35 Lightning II fighters, F-18 Super Hornets, F-16 Fighting Falcons. Deployment has not paused even while the Islamabad talks continue. B-1 Lancer and B-52 Stratofortress strategic bombers are in intensive training at RAF Fairford in England. If negotiations collapse, they will likely execute the second round of strikes against Iranian territory. 3 additional AC-130J Ghost Rider gunships are being deployed to Saudi Arabia within 48 to 72 hours. bringing the total in the region to 6, planned to participate in the second phase of Operation Epic Fury. A brigade from the 82nd Airborne Division has been deployed. Total ground force in the theater could reach 10,000 troops. C-17, Globemaster, and C-130. Hercules transport aircraft are running continuous deployment sorties carrying personnel, ammunition, armored vehicles, and logistics material around the clock. Washington's objective is unmistakable: to establish a fortified military zone in the Western Gulf, a fortress within which 3 carrier strike groups and their escort ships can operate in a protected environment while the economic clock runs down on Tehran. One analyst summarized it in terms that leave no diplomatic ambiguity. The ceasefire extension is not de-escalation, it is the front armor. Iran is not watching de-escalation approach. It is watching the final preparations for the most significant concentration of American military power in the Middle East since the Iraq War. And it responded by firing on cargo ships. But what happened on April 22nd was not just Iran breaking a ceasefire. It was Iran revealing that its decision-making architecture is no longer functioning as a coherent system. The IRGC acts separately. The Navy acts separately. The parliament speaker makes different statements than the foreign minister. President Pezeshkian speaks one position. IRGC Commander Vahidi executes a different one. Iran never officially accepted the ceasefire extension. It also never openly declared it was breaking it. It simply had gunboats fire on ships in the early morning hours and published the footage on state media. The IRGC's operational logic in that moment was not military. It was psychological. Iran needs the world to believe that it retains meaningful escalation options, that it can create consequences for the blockade that go beyond what the United States is willing to absorb, that the cost of maintaining the pressure will eventually exceed the strategic value of the pressure itself. The ship seizure footage was not published to demonstrate military capability. It was published to demonstrate that Iran still exists as an actor capable of creating disruption. When your wells are shutting down, when your revenue is zero, when your allies are watching rather than helping, when the third American carrier is 3 days away, proving you can still do something becomes the only card left. But here is the fatal miscalculation embedded in Iran's logic. Trump does not need to respond to the provocation. Every response Iran makes that falls short of the threshold that would require a military answer simply extends the timeline during which the economic strangulation continues. The IRGC seizes ships, the blockade holds, Iran loses another $500 million, the wells get closer to shutdown, the arithmetic gets worse. Washington does not need Iran to surrender publicly. It needs Iran's regime to arrive, eventually, at the negotiating table, with the enriched uranium on the table and no other cards left to play. And every day that Iran spends firing on cargo ships instead of producing a unified negotiating position is a day that arithmetic gets worse and the table gets smaller. Trump told CNN directly, there's no time pressure. He wants Iran to hand over its enriched uranium. Time is working for Washington, not against it. Iran understands this, which is why the threats it is broadcasting are escalating toward categories that, if executed, would create the kind of global disruption that might force American reconsideration of the blockade timeline. Iranian sources have drawn a coordinated escalation scenario. Multiple moves executed simultaneously that would collapse the world's oil supply, the Gulf's internet infrastructure, and the Europe-Asia maritime connection in a single operational moment. Examine each element. The Yanbu pipeline, Saudi Arabia's backup route, carrying crude oil to the Red Sea and bypassing Hormuz entirely. If Iranian missiles strike this pipeline, Saudi Arabia loses its alternative export corridor simultaneously with the Hormuz closure. The global supply disruption doubles. Fujairah, one of the world's largest fuel bunkering hubs in the UAE, sits within Iranian missile range and has been targeted previously. If Fujairah is struck, the refueling infrastructure that keeps commercial shipping operating across the Indian Ocean and Arabian Sea is degraded at exactly the moment when alternative routes are already under strain. Bab el-Mandeb, the strait at the bottom of the Red Sea that connects it to the Gulf of Aden. When Hormuz closes, this is the alternative. Iran's Houthi allies in Yemen nominally control the threat environment there. If Iran activates the Houthis to close Bab el-Mandeb simultaneously with Hormuz, the world's 2 primary oil transit choke points close at the same moment. A quarter of the world's seaborne energy trade disappears from the market simultaneously. And then the detail that has received the least attention but carries the most civilizational weight: underwater cables. Approximately 7 major cable systems passing through the Strait of Hormuz carry more than 97% of all Gulf internet traffic. Iranian sources published a detailed map of these cable routes and described them as extremely vulnerable. Iranian UAVs have previously attacked data centers in Bahrain and the UAE. If those cables are cut, Gulf states are plunged into digital darkness. Cloud infrastructure collapses. Financial systems go dark. Communications fail. If all of these execute simultaneously, The scenario produces outcomes that dwarf anything the current blockade has generated. A quarter of the world's energy supply disappears instantly. Saudi Arabia's backup road is gone. Gulf states lose their digital infrastructure. The pressure on Washington to find an exit from the crisis becomes global and immediate rather than regional and manageable. This is Iran's theoretical trump card. Now examine whether Iran can play it. The Houthi threat at Bab el-Mandeb is real but already managed. The USS George H.W. Bush is routing around it, specifically because Washington anticipated this vector. American naval assets are positioned to manage Bab el-Mandeb simultaneously with Hormuz, which is why the carrier is taking the longer southern route rather than the more direct northern passage. The Yanbu pipeline and Fujairah are within Iranian missile range, but striking them means Iran has officially broken the ceasefire, declared direct war on Saudi Arabia and the UAE, and unified the regional coalition against it completely. Gulf states that have been carefully maintaining neutrality while watching the US-Iran confrontation find themselves directly attacked. The political constraints that kept them from fully backing the blockade disappear the moment Iranian missiles land on their territory. Iran is not in a position to withstand a coalition that includes full Saudi and Emirati military participation. It is barely surviving the American blockade alone. The underwater cable threat is the most dramatic and the most self-defeating option available. Cutting the cables that carry Gulf internet traffic does not hurt the United States or its carriers. It hurts China, whose financial systems depend on that connectivity. It hurts India. It hurts every Gulf state that has been watching this conflict with cautious neutrality. It converts every party that has remained on the sidelines into an active adversary in a single operation. Iran's escalation cards are real in theory. In practice, each one costs more to play than whatever strategic value it delivers. And a regime whose decision-making architecture is fragmented between factions that are not coordinating with each other is not a regime capable of executing a coordinated multi-vector escalation with the precision that makes such a scenario strategically viable rather than catastrophically self-defeating. The real question is not whether Iran has these cards. It is whether the people making decisions inside Iran are sober enough to calculate the cost of each one before playing it. That question does not currently have a reassuring answer. Now look at what the ceasefire's effective end means for the world beyond the US-Iran bilateral confrontation. Brent crude exceeded $100 per barrel. Insurance companies have declared the Strait a risk zone. Premiums have multiplied to levels that make commercial transit economically irrational for vessels without military escort. Freight costs have risen up to 200% on some routes. Commercial traffic through the Strait has nearly stopped. The attacks on Greek and Liberian flagged ships have drawn third countries into a crisis that began as a confrontation between Washington and Tehran. Greece's government is responding to the targeting of vessels connected to Greek shipping interests. Liberia is the flag state of a ship whose crew were put at risk in international waters. Panama's flag flies on the MSC Francesca, now sitting in Iranian waters. This is no longer a bilateral conflict. It has become a multi-party maritime security emergency involving every nation whose commercial interests pass through waters that Iran is actively treating as a conflict zone. On April 22nd, military planners from more than 30 countries gathered in London to plan a multinational mission to safeguard Hormuz. The conference was not called by the United States. It was called by the international community's collective recognition that the Strait has stopped functioning as a secure commercial waterway, and that restoration requires coordinated international action rather than bilateral US-Iran negotiation alone. Iran's ship seizure operations are designed to accelerate this global pressure. Tehran wants insurance companies to shut down commercial transit completely. It wants freight costs to explode past the threshold where political pressure on Washington becomes unavoidable. It wants the global economy to pressure the United States into lifting the blockade faster than Washington's own patience and strategic calculus would otherwise permit. So far, it is not working. The United States is not backing down. The blockade holds. The third carrier is 3 days away. And every Iranian provocative act that falls short of the threshold for a required military response simply extends the window during which the economic strangulation runs. There is one dimension of the American position that receives insufficient attention in the public discussion of this crisis: the ammunition question. CSIS analysis indicates that over 7 weeks of the conflict, the United States has consumed approximately 45% of its precision strike missiles and roughly half of its Patriot interceptor inventory in the theater. These are significant figures. Sustained high-intensity operations at this level are not indefinitely maintainable without replenishment. But here is the asymmetry that makes this less constraining for Washington than it initially appears. The United States can replenish its ammunition. Its defense industrial base, currently operating under wartime production incentives, is generating munitions output at rates that have not been seen since the Cold War peak. The logistical chain connecting American production facilities to forward operating bases is functioning. The ships and aircraft moving resupply are operating. Iran cannot replenish what it has lost. The IRGC headquarters demolished, the intelligence chief and operations commander killed, air defense that collapsed in the first weeks when over 100 coalition aircraft entered Iranian airspace, struck central Tehran, and returned. Bushehr naval base leveled. The Imam Ali logistics hub struck. The supply chains to Hezbollah and the Houthis disrupted. Underground facilities penetrated by B-2 bombers carrying bunker-busting munitions that were supposed to be unable to reach them. Pentagon intelligence reports suggest that 50% of Iran's missile stocks, 60% of its naval forces, and most of its air force remain operational. Those figures are more reassuring for Iran than the operational picture suggests, because the remaining capacity is being distributed under the Mosaic Defense Plan, a doctrine of distributed force that deliberately breaks the chain of command to autonomous cells to survive decapitation strikes. The problem with the Mosaic Defense Plan is that it trades centralized coordination for survivability. The cells that survive function independently. But when your strategic situation requires coordinated decision-making at the highest level, an independent cell architecture means there is no single authority capable of issuing and enforcing orders that all elements will execute. No one knows who is commanding Iran's distributed forces. The IRGC acts separately from the Navy. Both act separately from the diplomatic channels. The parliament speaker contradicts the foreign minister contradicts the IRGC. And above all of them, the supreme leader, who is supposed to be the final authority, is in intensive care. This is the structural reality behind the ship seizure footage published at 5:47 in the morning. Not a coordinated strategic operation, a panicked reflex by a military wing that is operating without unified political guidance, doing the only thing it knows how to do, which is escalate, hoping that escalation changes a strategic equation that is otherwise running entirely against it. The nuclear dimension of this crisis has entered territory that, even a month ago, would have been dismissed as alarmist speculation. Trump announced publicly that Iran has agreed not to possess nuclear weapons and to hand over its stockpiles of enriched uranium. Iran has not officially confirmed this. Between the American president's announcement and an actual verified handover lies a gap in which the IRGC's calculation about whether to accept institutional defeat or escalate towards something worse is still being made. And then, from former CIA analyst Larry Johnson on the program Judging Freedom, an unverified but deeply alarming claim. During an emergency White House meeting, Trump allegedly requested nuclear codes. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs reportedly said no. There is no official confirmation of this claim. There will never be official confirmation of this claim. But the fact that such a claim has emerged and circulated in the intelligence analysis community tells you something about where the perceived threshold of this conflict sits. When serious analysts are discussing whether nuclear options entered a presidential conversation, the conflict has moved into a category that is qualitatively different from everything that preceded it. This is not to say nuclear weapons will be used. It is to say that the people watching this crisis most carefully are no longer dismissing any scenario as beyond the range of consideration. And Iran's decision-making about whether to execute its remaining escalation options is being made in the shadow of that awareness. 3 scenarios are on the table for the next 72 hours. Each of them leads somewhere different, and which one materializes will be determined by decisions being made right now inside a regime that cannot agree on who is making decisions. The first scenario. Iran arrives at the negotiating table with a unified proposal. Ghalibaf's diplomatic faction assembles enough institutional authority to produce a framework that addresses Washington's core demand about the nuclear stockpile. The blockade is lifted in stages as verification proceeds. The wells are saved before the geological damage becomes permanent. The regime survives in a diminished but functional form. This is the scenario Washington designed the entire pressure architecture to produce. The blockade, the storage clock, the well shutdown timeline, the 3 carrier groups, the B-1s and B-52s training at RAF Fairford, all of it is engineered to make this scenario the only rational choice from Tehran's perspective. The question is whether any faction inside Tehran currently has both the authority to accept it and the institutional survival to survive accepting it. The second scenario. Iran fails to produce a unified negotiating position. The IRGC continues provocations. Trump launches the second phase of Operation Epic Fury with 3 aircraft carriers in the theater, 150-plus fighter jets, fully resupplied precision strike inventory, and strategic bombers that have been training for exactly this moment. The targets are different from the first phase, deeper. More consequential for Iran's long-term military capacity. The third scenario, neither negotiation nor escalation. Status quo continues. The blockade persists. Iran's economy absorbs $500 million per day in losses. The wells shut down. The geological damage accumulates. The domestic pressure from a population that cannot find fuel in an oil-producing country builds toward a threshold that no propaganda figure and no state television broadcast can contain. This is Trump's preferred scenario, because time is working entirely in Washington's favor. Every day the blockade holds, Iran's position weakens. Every IRGC provocation that falls short of requiring a military response simply extends the timeline during which that weakening proceeds. Iran's every panic move, the ship seizures, the weapons fire, the missile displays in Revolution Square, is not improving its strategic situation. It is demonstrating to every watching government that a regime under this kind of pressure is not thinking clearly. And a regime that is not thinking clearly is a regime that is running out of room. Iran spent decades building Hormuz into the ultimate strategic weapon, the threat that kept governments nervous, the card that made every negotiation lean slightly in Tehran's direction. For 45 years, the mere possibility of closing the strait was enough to shape the behavior of nations that had no other connection to Iran's political agenda. On April 22nd, at 5:47 in the morning, the IRGC fired on a cargo ship, and Trump said nothing, not because Washington is afraid of what Iran will do next, because Washington is watching what the blockade is already doing to Iran without requiring any additional American action. Because the third carrier is 3 days away, and its arrival completes the most overwhelming concentration of American naval power assembled in the modern era. Because the wells are about to shut down and the geological clock, once started, does not stop ticking just because the IRGC seized a container ship and published the footage. The ceasefire in Hormuz has effectively ended. What replaces it is not a new phase of military exchange. It is the final phase of an economic and strategic strangulation that the United States designed to make Iran defeat itself faster than any missile campaign could achieve. The IRGC thinks it is escalating. It is accelerating its own collapse. $500 million a day, wells approaching shutdown. A third carrier 3 days out. 30 countries in London planning a multinational security mission. Commercial shipping insurance making the strait economically impassable. A population in fuel lines in an oil-producing country. A supreme leader in intensive care. A decision-making architecture fragmented between factions that contradict each other publicly while the world watches. Iran's provocations have not changed any of this. They have only confirmed it. The strikes backfired. Not because the targets were wrong. Because the strategic logic was wrong. Because a regime that is losing $500 million every 24 hours cannot escalate its way out of arithmetic. Because firing on cargo ships does not open oil wells that are 2 weeks from permanent shutdown. Because publishing seizure footage does not stop the USS George H.W. Bush from arriving in 3 days. The trap was set a long time ago. Iran walked into it slowly, then all at once. And what is massive and moving and coming through the water right now will make everything that has happened before look like the warning that was not heeded. The clock is running, Washington is waiting, and Iran is running out of everything else.